Thomas Stormwind thought he was tracking wounded deer when he found the overturned canoe half buried in autumn leaves beside Willow Creek. Inside, 2 newborn infants lay wrapped in blood-stained blankets, and pinned to the smaller one's chest was a note written in shaking handwriting. "Don't let her find them. She'll kill them both just like she killed me. Run far and never look back. The canoe shouldn't have been there." Thomas had walked this creek bend every morning for 3 years, checking his trap lines, watching for game sign, memorizing every fallen log and bent branch like a map written in his bones. The old birch bark vessel sat wedged against a cluster of willows as if it had been there for decades, yet the wood was fresh, the hide binding still supple with recent use. The morning frost hadn't touched it the way it had everything else, suggesting it had been placed there after the coldest part of the night.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
He approached slowly, every hunter's instinct screaming that something was wrong. The morning mist clung to the water like smoke, and the usual sounds of the creek had gone silent. No birds calling, no squirrels chattering, not even the whisper of wind through the cattails. Just the soft gurgle of water moving over stones and the thunder of his own heartbeat in his ears. The very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. Thomas had learned to trust his instincts. Half Odawa, half French settler, he'd grown up caught between 2 worlds, never fully belonging to either. His grandfather had taught him the old ways of reading sign and moving silent through the forest, while his father had shown him how to survive in the white man's towns when hunting season ended. Both had taught him that when the woods went quiet, a wise man listened. And right now, the silence was so complete, it made his skin crawl. He knelt beside the canoe, noting the gouges in its side, the way the prow had been deliberately shoved into the muddy bank. Someone had hidden this thing in a hurry, and they'd done it recently. The morning dew hadn't had time to settle on the exposed wood, which meant whoever had been here had passed through after dawn, maybe within the hour. The gouges looked fresh, too, as if someone had dragged the canoe over rocks and fallen logs in their desperation to reach this hidden spot. That's when he heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it, like the mewing of a kitten or the whisper of wind through dry grass. But Thomas knew better. He'd heard that sound before, in cabins during the long winter months when families huddled around fires and prayed. Their food would last until spring. The sound of hunger, of need, of something small and helpless crying out for comfort. He pulled back the edge of the canvas covering the canoe's interior, and his breath caught in his throat. 2 babies, so small they could have fit in his cupped palms, lay nestled in a nest of woolen blankets. The girl was crying, her tiny fists waving in the air, her face red with hunger and cold. The boy was quieter, his dark eyes wide and alert, watching Thomas with an intensity that seemed impossible for something so young. Both were wrapped in blankets that had once been white, but were now stained with mud and something darker. Thomas had never been good with children. He'd lived alone for so long that he'd forgotten how to be gentle with fragile things. His own childhood had been harsh, marked by the struggle to survive in a world that didn't want him. But something about these 2 broke through his careful walls. He reached in with trembling hands, lifting the girl first, feeling the bird-light weight of her against his chest. She quieted immediately, her crying fading to soft hiccups. As if she recognized something safe in his touch, the boy came next, and as Thomas cradled them both, he felt the piece of paper crinkle against his fingers. It was tucked under the boy's blanket, the handwriting rushed and desperate, the ink smeared in places as if tears had fallen on the words while they were still wet. The paper itself was expensive, the kind used by wealthy folks in town, but it was wrinkled and torn at the edges, suggesting it had been written in haste. "Don't let her find them," Thomas read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Kill them both just like she killed me. Run far and never look back. They're all that's left of something good in this world. Keep them safe. Keep them hidden. She has eyes everywhere and a memory like a steel trap. Trust no one who asks too many questions. The girl is Ember. The boy is Reed. Tell them their mother loved them more than life itself. Tell them she died trying to keep them free. Thomas looked around the creek bend, suddenly feeling exposed. The mist was lifting, revealing the open meadow beyond the willows, the old game trail that connected to the main road 5 miles east. Anyone could be watching from the tree line, and he'd never know until it was too late. His years as a tracker had taught him to think like prey when necessary. And right now, every instinct told him he was being hunted. He'd been a tracker long enough to read the signs that others missed. The way the grass was pressed down in a line leading away from the creek suggested someone had dragged the canoe here, fighting against its weight and the uneven ground. Boot prints in the soft earth near the water's edge, small and narrow, belonging to a woman. But there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The prints were uneven, one deeper than the other, as if the person had been favoring one leg. The prints were too deep for someone walking normally. Whoever had been here had been staggering, maybe hurt, definitely exhausted. And there were drops of blood on the leaves, dark spots that hadn't had time to dry completely. Fresh blood, and lots of it. Thomas knelt and touched one of the drops with his finger. Still tacky, which meant it had been spilled within the last few hours. Someone had been badly wounded, fighting for their life and the lives of these children. Thomas wrapped the babies more tightly in their blankets and stood, his mind racing. He could take them to town, hand them over to the sheriff or the preacher's wife. Let someone else deal with the mystery of where they'd come from and why someone had hidden them like contraband. But something in the note's desperate tone made him hesitate. The writer had been educated, intelligent, someone who'd had time to think about their words, even in the face of death. This wasn't a casual warning. She'll kill them both just like she killed me. The words echoed in his head as he looked down at the 2 small faces peering up at him. Ember had stopped crying entirely, her tiny hand wrapped around his finger with surprising strength. Reed watched everything with those dark, knowing eyes, as if he understood more than any baby should. There was something about them, something that made Thomas think of his grandfather's stories about children marked by fate. Thomas had seen enough death to recognize the smell of it. It clung to the canoe like perfume, mixing with the scent of birch bark and old leather. Someone had died here, or somewhere close by, and these children were the only witnesses, the only survivors. The thought made his blood run cold, because if someone was willing to kill a mother for her babies, they wouldn't hesitate to kill him too. He made his decision the way he made all his decisions, quickly and without looking back. He couldn't take them to town, not yet. Not until he knew who she was and why she wanted these babies dead. Not until he understood what kind of danger he was walking into. His grandfather had always said that some fights chose you, whether you wanted them or not. This felt like one of those fights. Thomas carried them back to his cabin, a rough-hewn structure tucked into a grove of pines 2 miles from the nearest neighbor. He'd built it himself after his father died, choosing isolation over the complications of living too close to people who would never quite accept him. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a stone fireplace and thick walls that kept out the winter wind. More importantly, it was hidden, invisible from the main trails unless you knew exactly where to look. He laid the babies on his bed, using pillows to keep them from rolling, and tried to remember everything his mother had told him about caring for infants. She'd helped deliver half the babies in their old settlement, back when he was young enough to believe the world was a safe place for children. Her voice echoed in his memory, patient and gentle, explaining how to test the temperature of milk, how to support a baby's head, how to tell the difference between hungry cries and sick cries. They needed milk, and he had none. The nearest
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Cow was at the Henderson farm, and Mrs. Henderson asked too many questions for his comfort. She was a good woman, but she had a tongue that wagged faster than a dog's tail, and within hours the whole county would know about Thomas Stormwind and his mysterious babies. But he remembered something his grandmother had shown him, a mixture of warm water and honey that could sustain a baby for a few days. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. As he prepared the makeshift formula, Thomas found himself studying the note again. The handwriting was educated, the words carefully chosen despite the obvious panic. This wasn't some desperate frontier woman who'd gotten in over her head. This was someone who'd had time to think, to plan, to choose her words with precision. Someone who'd known exactly what she was up against and had still chosen to fight. The ink was expensive too, the kind used by people with money and education. She has eyes everywhere and a memory like a steel trap. That phrase bothered him more than the rest. It suggested someone with resources, connections, the kind of person who could track down a hidden baby no matter where it was taken. The kind of person who made enemies disappear without a trace. Thomas had heard stories of such people, whispered around campfires and in the back rooms of saloons. People who smiled in public and did their killing in private. Thomas had made his share of enemies over the years. He'd worked as a scout for the army during the Indian Wars, tracking stolen horses and runaway soldiers. He'd guided hunting parties into the deep woods, helped settlers find lost cattle, even done some work for the railroad when they needed someone who could read the land like a book. But he'd never tangled with anyone who scared him the way this mysterious she already did. There was something in the note's tone that spoke of evil beyond the ordinary. The babies were hungry, crying in thin, desperate voices that cut through him like knives. He tried the honey water first, using a clean rag to let them suck the sweetness from the cloth. Ember took to it immediately, her tiny mouth working eagerly, her small hands gripping his finger with surprising strength. Reed was more cautious, but eventually hunger won out over suspicion. Both seemed to understand that this strange man was their only hope of survival. As he fed them, Thomas noticed other details that had escaped him in the shock of discovery. Both babies had unusual birthmarks, small crescents on their left shoulders that looked almost like brands. Their hair was darker than most newborns, and their eyes held a depth that seemed impossible for their age. They looked like siblings, but not quite twins. Close in age, maybe born weeks apart. There was something about them that made Thomas think of his grandfather's stories about children born under strange stars. The afternoon sun was fading by the time Thomas felt confident they were fed and warm. He'd fashioned a makeshift cradle from an old wooden crate, lining it with his softest blankets. The babies slept fitfully, making small sounds that tugged at something deep in his chest. He found himself watching them with a protectiveness he'd never felt before, as if something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what mattered. He spent the evening cleaning and oiling his rifle, checking the loads in his pistol, making sure his knife was sharp. He'd learned long ago that when trouble came to the frontier, it came fast and hard. The note's warning echoed in his mind as he worked. Trust no one who asks too many questions. But Thomas had questions of his own, and they were eating at him like poison. Who was the woman who'd written the note? How had she died? And most importantly, who was this she that everyone seemed so afraid of? Night fell with unusual quiet. Thomas sat in his chair by the fire, rifle across his knees, listening to the forest sounds beyond his walls. The babies slept peacefully, their breathing soft and regular. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that somewhere in the darkness, unfriendly eyes were measuring distances and planning approaches. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound carried the promise of violence. He dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound. A branch creaking in the wind. The distant howl of a coyote. the soft whisper of something moving through the underbrush. Each noise sent his hand to his weapon, his body tense with anticipation. But morning came without incident, and the babies woke hungry, but healthy. Still, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that his time was running out. Thomas knew he couldn't stay isolated forever. He needed supplies, information, some idea of what he was up against. But the note's warning about trusting no one made every option feel like a trap. Still, there was one person who might help, someone who'd earned his trust through years of straight dealing. Old Pete Hutchins ran the trading post at Crow's Crossing, 15 miles south. He'd been on the frontier since before the war, had seen everything and survived by keeping his mouth shut and his eyes open. Thomas wrapped the babies in warm blankets and prepared for the journey. He'd travel light, stick to the old hunting trails, avoid the main roads where curious eyes might spot him. The babies seemed to sense something was different. They were quieter than usual, watching him with those dark, knowing eyes as he loaded his pack. It was almost as if they understood that their survival depended on staying hidden. As he stepped out of the cabin, Thomas felt the weight of the decision he'd made. He was no longer just a lone hunter trying to survive on the edges of civilization. He was a protector, a guardian, responsible for two small lives that someone had deemed worth killing for. The thought should have terrified him, but instead, it filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. For the first time since his father's death, he had something worth fighting for. The forest seemed different as he walked, more alive with possibilities both good and bad. Every shadow could hide a threat, every sound could signal danger. But Thomas had spent his life in these woods, and he knew how to move like smoke through the trees, how to read the wind and follow the paths that others couldn't see. His grandfather's training served him well as he navigated the maze of game trails and hidden routes. Crow's Crossing was a day's hard walk, but he'd make it by nightfall if he pushed. The babies rode quietly in the sling he'd fashioned from blankets and rope, their small bodies warm against his chest. Ember slept most of the way, but Reed stayed awake, his dark eyes taking in everything as if he were memorizing the route. Thomas found himself talking to them in soft whispers, telling them about the landmarks they passed, the animals they might see, the stories his grandfather had told him about these same woods. Thomas had no way of knowing that his decision to seek help would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything he thought he knew about the world. He had no way of knowing that the woman who'd written that desperate note had been running from something far worse than an ordinary killer. And he had no way of knowing that by the time he reached Crow's Crossing, she would already be looking for him. The sun was setting behind the mountains when Thomas finally saw the smoke rising from Pete's chimney. Crow's Crossing was more of a wide spot in the trail than a real town. Just the trading post, a small saloon, and a handful of cabins scattered along the creek. But it was civilization of a sort, and right now, that felt like sanctuary. The warm glow of lamplight in the windows promised safety, human companionship, answers to the questions that had been plaguing him. He approached carefully, studying the horses tied outside the saloon, looking for signs of strangers or trouble. Everything seemed normal, but Thomas had learned not to trust appearances. He circled wide, coming up on the trading post from the back, using the shadows to hide his approach. The babies sensed his tension and remained perfectly still, as if they understood that their lives depended on silence. Pete was alone inside, counting inventory by lamplight. He looked up as Thomas entered, his weathered face breaking into a smile that faded when he saw the babies. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly. "Tom Stormwind with a pair of young ones. That's not something you see every day. I need help." "Pete," Thomas said simply, "and I need you to keep quiet about it." Pete nodded slowly, his eyes taking in the rifle, the tension in Thomas's shoulders, the way he kept glancing at the windows. "Trouble?" he asked. "The worst kind," Thomas replied. "The kind that kills women and comes looking for their babies." Pete Hutchins set down his ledger and studied Thomas with the calculating eyes of a man who'd survived 30 years on the frontier by knowing when to ask questions and when to keep his mouth shut. The trading post fell into the kind of silence that comes before storms, heavy with unspoken truths and the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending shadows dancing across the rough-hewn walls. "Show me," Pete said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas hesitated for a moment, then carefully unwrapped the babies from their makeshift sling. Pete's weathered hands were surprisingly gentle as he examined them, his eyes taking in the unusual birthmarks, the dark hair, the way they seemed to watch everything with an intelligence that belonged to much older souls. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "They're barely a day old." Thomas pulled out the blood-stained note and handed it to Pete, who read it twice before looking up with troubled eyes. "This handwriting," Pete said slowly, "I've seen it before. On orders for expensive goods, silk ribbons and fine china, things that don't belong in a place like this. Someone with money and education, someone who stood out because they didn't belong. You know who wrote this?" Thomas asked, his heart pounding. Pete nodded grimly, moving to the window to peer out at the darkening street. "Woman named Catherine Whitmore. Showed up about 6 months ago. Claimed to be a widow looking for a fresh start. Bought the old Jameson place up on Cedar Ridge, paid cash, kept to herself mostly. But there was something about her that didn't sit right with folks." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of something? Pete was quiet for a long moment, his eyes still scanning the street outside. She had this way of looking at people, like she could see right through them to their secrets. And she asked too many questions about the local families, especially the ones with young children. Made people nervous, but she had money and minded her own business, so we let her be. The babies stirred in their makeshift cradle, and Thomas instinctively reached for them, his protective instincts now fully awakened. Pete noticed the gesture and nodded approvingly. "You're already attached to them," he observed. "That's good. They're going to need someone who cares more about their lives than his own. Tell me about this woman who's looking for them," Thomas said, settling back into his chair with Reed in his arms. Pete's expression darkened, and he moved away from the window, as if even discussing her might draw unwanted attention. "That's where things get complicated. About a week ago, another woman arrived in town. Called herself Magdalena Ravenhill. Claimed to be Catherine's sister. But there was something wrong about her from the start." Pete paused to pour himself a glass of whiskey, his hands shaking slightly. "She was beautiful, I'll give her that. The kind of beautiful that makes men forget their own names. But her eyes were cold, like looking into a winter lake. And she had this way of speaking that made your skin crawl, like she was tasting each word before she said it." Thomas felt embers shift in his other arm, and he looked down to see her dark eyes fixed on Pete's face, as if she were listening to every word. "What did she want?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Pete took a long sip of whiskey before continuing. "She came to the trading post asking about Catherine, said she was worried because her sister had stopped writing. But the way she asked the questions, it was like she already knew the answers. She was hunting," Thomas said, and Pete nodded grimly. "That's what it felt like. She spent 3 days in town, talking to everyone, asking about Catherine's habits, her friends, whether she'd seemed worried about anything. She was particularly interested in whether Catherine had been seen with any children." The wind outside grew stronger, howling around the corners of the building like a living thing. Thomas felt the babies tense in his arms, and he began to rock them gently, humming an old Odawa lullaby his grandmother had taught him. The sound seemed to calm them, but Pete watched with worried eyes. "There's more," Pete said finally. 2 days ago, Catherine's body was found in the creek behind her house. Sheriff said it looked like she'd fallen and hit her head on the rocks, but I've seen enough accidents to know the difference between falling and being pushed. She had defensive wounds on her hands, and there was blood under her fingernails. Thomas felt his blood run cold. She fought back, he said, and Pete nodded. Must have. But here's the thing that really bothers me. When they found her, she was wearing a nightgown, but her feet were bare and cut up like she'd been running through the woods. And there were tracks around her house, boot prints that didn't match any of the shoes they found inside. The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. Catherine had been murdered, just as the note claimed, and her killer was still out there looking for the babies. He looked down at Ember and Reed, so small and helpless, and felt a fierce protectiveness rise in his chest. What happened to Magdalena after the body was found? He asked. Pete's expression grew even more troubled. That's the strangest part. She disappeared the same night Catherine's body was discovered. Just vanished, like she'd never been there at all. But here's what's got me spooked. People are starting to forget about her. When I ask folks about the beautiful woman who was asking all the questions, they look at me like I'm talking nonsense. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold wind outside. You think she's still around? Pete nodded grimly. I know she is. I've seen her, or glimpses of her, moving through the shadows at night. And there have been other things. Livestock going missing, dogs refusing to go out after dark, children waking up screaming from nightmares they can't remember. The babies began to fuss, and Thomas realized they were hungry again. Pete watched. As he prepared more of the honey-water mixture, his expression thoughtful. You know you can't stay here, he said finally. If she's as dangerous as you think, this place is too exposed. Too many people coming and going, too many eyes watching. Thomas nodded, though the thought of leaving the relative safety of the trading post filled him with dread. Where can I go? She seems to have resources, connections. How do I hide from someone like that? Pete was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. There's a place, he said finally. An old mining camp up in the mountains, abandoned for years. It's about 30 miles north, hidden in a box canyon that most folks don't even know exists. You think it would be safe there? Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. Nowhere would be truly safe until this woman was stopped. Pete shrugged. Safer than here. The camp has fresh water, some of the buildings are still sound, and there's only one way in or out. You could see anyone coming from miles away, as if summoned by their conversation. The sound of hoofbeats echoed through the night air. Pete immediately extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness except for the faint glow of the fire. Thomas felt his heart hammering as he gathered the babies closer, his hand instinctively moving to his rifle. The hoofbeats grew closer, then stopped directly outside the trading post. Thomas could hear the creak of leather as someone dismounted, followed by the soft sound of footsteps on the wooden porch. Pete motioned for him to stay back, then crept to the window to peer through a crack in the shutters. 3 riders. Pete whispered, Don't recognize them, that they're armed and they're looking for something, or someone. The footsteps moved around the building, circling like predators. Thomas could hear them testing the doors and windows, checking for other entrances. The babies seemed to sense the danger and remained perfectly still. A soft knock came at the front door, so polite and civilized that it was somehow more terrifying than if they'd tried to break it down. A woman's voice called out, musical and sweet, but with an undertone that made Thomas's skin crawl. Hello? Is anyone there? I'm looking for my sister's children. Pete's face went white in the firelight. He mouthed a single word, her. Thomas felt every muscle in his body tense as the voice continued. I know you're in there. I can smell them, you know. The scent of innocence, of blood not yet spilled. My poor sister tried so hard to keep them from me, but destiny cannot be denied. The voice was getting closer, as if she were pressing her face against the door. I'm not unreasonable. Give them to me, and I'll make it quick. Keep them from me, and I'll make you watch as I tear them apart piece by piece. The choice is yours. Thomas was already moving, gathering the babies in his pack with practiced efficiency. Pete pointed toward the back of the store, where a narrow staircase led to a trapdoor in the floor. "Storm cellar," he whispered. "Tunnel leads to the creek. You can get to the woods from there." The front door exploded inward just as Thomas reached the trapdoor. In the brief moment before Pete slammed it shut above him, he caught a glimpse of the woman who'd been hunting them. She was indeed beautiful, with pale skin and dark hair, but her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and when she smiled, her teeth were too sharp, too white. "Where are they?" he heard her say, her voice now stripped of all pretense of civility. There was a sound of violence, of furniture being overturned, and Pete's pained cry echoed through the floorboards. Thomas wanted to help his friend, but the babies came first. He had to get them to safety. The tunnel was narrow and damp, carved from the living rock by some long-dead miner. Thomas crawled through it on his hands and knees, the babies strapped to his chest, their small bodies warm against his heart. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of the search continuing, growing more frantic and violent. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, but finally Thomas saw starlight ahead. He emerged beside the creek, gasping in the cold night air, and immediately began running toward the tree line. The babies bounced against his chest, but they remained silent, as if they understood that their lives depended on it. He'd made it perhaps 100 yards into the woods when he heard Pete scream. The sound cut through the night like a blade, filled with such agony that Thomas stumbled and nearly fell. He wanted to go back, to help the man who'd risked everything to save them, but he forced himself to keep running. Pete's sacrifice would be meaningless if he didn't get the babies to safety. The forest seemed to close around them like a protective embrace, and Thomas used every skill his grandfather had taught him to move silently through the underbrush. He could hear pursuit behind him, crashing through the trees with no regard for stealth. Whatever Magdalena Ravenhill was, she was confident in her ability to track them down. Thomas ran until his lungs burned and his legs trembled with exhaustion. The babies never made a sound, but he could feel their rapid heartbeats against his chest, could sense their fear even through their silence. Finally, when he could run no more, he found shelter in a shallow cave hidden behind a waterfall. The sound of the falling water would mask their scent and muffle any sounds they might make. Thomas collapsed against the cave wall, his body shaking with exhaustion and terror. The babies stirred in his arms, and he realized they were hungry again. With trembling hands, he prepared more of the honey-water mixture, grateful for the small comfort he could provide. As he fed them, Thomas tried to process what he'd witnessed. The woman who'd called herself Magdalena Ravenhill was no ordinary killer. There had been something inhuman about her, something that made his primitive brain scream in recognition of an ancient enemy. His grandfather had told him stories of such creatures, beings that wore human faces but hungered for things that no human should desire. The babies finished feeding and settled into an uneasy sleep, but Thomas remained awake, watching the cave entrance and listening for any sign of pursuit. The night dragged on with agonizing slowness, filled with shadows that might have been threats and sounds that could have been approaching death. Dawn came gray and cold, filtering through the mist that rose from the waterfall. Thomas waited until the sun was fully up before venturing out of the cave, his rifle ready and his senses alert for any sign of danger. The forest seemed peaceful, but he knew better than to trust appearances. He needed to reach the abandoned mining camp Pete had mentioned, but first he had to find out what had happened to his friend. The thought of Pete's sacrifice filled him with guilt and rage, but he pushed those emotions aside. The babies needed him to be strong, to be smart, to be their protector in a world that had suddenly become much more dangerous. The journey to the mining camp would take days, and Thomas knew he couldn't make it without proper supplies. He would have to take risks, venture into other settlements, trust people he didn't know. But as he looked down at Ember and Reed, sleeping peacefully in his arms, he knew he would do whatever it took to keep them safe. The hunt had truly begun, and Thomas Stormwind was no longer just a tracker trying to survive on the frontier. He was a guardian, a protector, standing between two innocent lives and something that wore the face of humanity, but hungered for their destruction. The thought should have terrified him, but instead, it filled him with grim determination. He gathered his pack and stepped out into the morning light, the babies secure in their sling against his chest. Behind him, the waterfall continued its ancient song, washing away the traces of their presence. Ahead lay the unknown, dangerous and full of threats, but also full of possibilities. Thomas Stormwind had found his purpose at last, and he would not yield it without a fight. Thomas spent 3 days moving through the wilderness like a ghost, avoiding main trails and settlements, living off berries and stream water while the baby survived on his dwindling supply of honey. On the 4th morning, exhaustion and desperation drove him to risk contact with civilization at a remote trading post called Devil's Elbow, a collection of ramshackle buildings that served trappers and prospectors heading into the deep mountains. The proprietor was a grizzled old mountain man named Ezra Blackwood, who took one look at Thomas's haggard appearance and the babies in his arms, and immediately ushered him into a back room. "You look like a man running from the devil himself," Ezra said, his voice rough from years of tobacco and whiskey. "And carrying precious cargo that someone wants real bad." Thomas was beyond the point of pretense. "There's a woman hunting these babies," he said simply. "She killed their mother, and she'll kill anyone who gets in her way. I need supplies and information, and I need to know if she's been through here." Ezra's weathered face grew serious as he examined the infants, his experienced eyes taking in their unusual birthmarks, and the way they seemed to watch everything with preternatural awareness. "Funny thing about babies," Ezra said slowly. "Most folks see them as blank slates, innocent and empty. But these two got something different about them. Something that makes you think they're seeing things the rest of us can't." He paused to stroke his beard, his eyes distant. "Had a woman come through here 2 days ago, asking about a half-breed tracker and twin babies. Beautiful as sin and twice as dangerous." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. "Did you tell her anything?" Ezra shook his head grimly. "Told her I hadn't seen hide nor hair of what she was looking for. But she had this way of looking at a man, like she could see right through his lies. Made me feel like a rabbit staring down a wolf." He moved to the window and peered out at the empty street. "She's still in the area, I can feel it. Evil like that leaves a stain on the air." The old man disappeared into his storeroom and returned with supplies, milk powder, clean blankets, ammunition, and dried meat. "There's something else you need to know," he said as he packed the goods. "You're not the first person to come through here running from her. About a month ago, a circuit preacher named Father Miguel stopped by, scared out of his wits. Sighed. He'd been performing baptisms in the settlements to the south when he encountered something that shook his faith to its core." Thomas leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What kind of something?" Ezra's voice dropped to a whisper. "Father Miguel said he'd been called to bless a newborn in the town of Salvation Creek. When he got there, he found the whole place in an uproar. 3 babies had been born that week, all with strange birthmarks, all showing signs of unusual intelligence. The families were terrified, whispering about curses and devil's spawn. The babies stirred in their makeshift cradle, and Thomas noticed that both Ember and Reed were listening intently, their dark eyes fixed on Ezra's face. It was impossible, but he could have sworn they understood every word being spoken. "What happened to those babies?" Thomas asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. "That's where it gets strange," Ezra continued. "Father Miguel said a woman arrived in town claiming to be a specialist in unusual births, someone who could help the families understand what was happening. She was charming, educated, spoke multiple languages. The families trusted her." He paused, his expression growing darker. "Within a week, All 3 babies had vanished. The families claimed had given them to relatives in distant towns, but Father Miguel didn't believe it. He started asking questions, poking around, trying to find out what really happened. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. And Ezra met his eyes with a look of profound sadness. The families started dying. Accidents, illnesses, mysterious disappearances. Anyone who'd had contact with those babies, anyone who might have information about where they'd gone. Father Miguel barely escaped with his life. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about Ember and Reed, it was part of a larger pattern, a systematic hunt for children with specific characteristics. Thomas looked down at the babies in his arms, seeing their birthmarks in a new light. "You think she's collecting them?" he said, and Ezra nodded grimly. Father Miguel thought so too. He'd been researching old texts, trying to understand what made these children special. He found references to something called the Covenant of Shadows, an ancient ritual that required the sacrifice of innocents marked by specific signs. Ezra's voice grew even quieter. According to the texts, someone who completed this ritual would gain power beyond imagination, the ability to control minds, to bend reality itself to their will. Thomas felt sick. The babies he'd been protecting weren't just innocent victims. They were components in some horrific magical working. "How many does she need?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. Ezra shrugged. Father Miguel wasn't sure. The texts were fragmentary, written in languages that were already ancient when Rome fell, but he thought it was 7, maybe 9. Children born under specific celestial conditions, marked with the crescent sign, possessing unusual awareness. The sound of hoofbeats outside made both men freeze. Ezra moved to the window and peered through the shutters, his face going pale. 3 riders, he whispered. "And they're not here for supplies." Thomas was already moving, gathering the babies and his pack with practiced efficiency. Ezra pointed toward a hidden door behind a stack of grain sacks. "Root cellar. There's a tunnel that leads to the old mine shaft. You can get to the river from there." The front door rattled as someone tested the handle. Thomas could hear voices outside, too quiet to make out words, but unmistakably threatening in tone. He slipped through the hidden door just as Ezra opened the front entrance, his voice cheerful and welcoming despite the fear in his eyes. "Afternoon, folks. What can I do for you today?" A woman's voice, musical and cultured, drifted down to the cellar. "We're looking for a man, possibly traveling with children. He might have passed through here in the last few days." Thomas recognized the voice from the trading post attack. It was Magdalena Ravenhill, and she was close enough to touch. He pressed himself against the cellar wall, the babies somehow sensing the danger and remaining perfectly silent. "Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description," Ezra replied, his voice steady despite the mortal peril he was in. "Been pretty quiet around here lately. Most folks avoid Devil's Elbow unless they're desperate for supplies." There was a long pause, filled with tension so thick it seemed to press against the floorboards, above Thomas's head. "You're lying," Magdalena said, her voice no longer musical but flat and cold. "I can smell them. The scent of innocence, of blood that calls to blood. They were here recently." "Where did they go?" Thomas heard the sound of Violet's furniture being overturned, Ezra's grunt of pain. He wanted to help the old man, but the babies came first. He had to get them to safety. The tunnel was longer than Pete's had been, carved through solid rock by miners who dreamed of striking it rich in these unforgiving mountains. Thomas crawled through it on his belly, the baby strapped to his back, their small bodies warm against his spine. Behind him, he could hear the search continuing, growing more violent and destructive. He emerged near the riverbank, gasping in the thin mountain air, and immediately began running toward the tree line. The abandoned mining camp was still 20 miles away, but he knew these mountains better than most. There were game trails, hidden valleys, Places where a man could disappear if he knew how to read the land. The sound of screaming echoed across the valley, high and agonized and unmistakably human. Thomas stumbled, nearly falling, as he recognized Ezra's voice raised in mortal agony. The old man was paying the price for helping them, just as Pete had. The guilt was crushing, but Thomas forced himself to keep running. Their sacrifices would be meaningless if he didn't save the babies. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs trembled with exhaustion, following deer paths and hidden streams through terrain that would challenge even experienced mountain men. The babies never complained, never cried, as if they understood that their lives depended on silence. Finally, as the sun began to set, Thomas found shelter in a narrow cave hidden behind a grove of pine trees. The cave was small but deep, with fresh water seeping from the walls and evidence that it had been used by travelers before. Thomas collapsed against the stone wall, his body shaking with exhaustion and horror. The babies stirred in their sling, and he realized they were hungry again. With trembling hands, he prepared milk from the powder Ezra had given him, grateful for the old man's final gift. As he fed them, Thomas tried to process what he'd learned. The hunt for Ember and Reed was part of something much larger, a systematic collection of children for some unspeakable purpose. Magdalena Ravenhill wasn't just a killer, she was conducting a ritual that would give her power beyond imagination. And she was willing to torture and murder anyone who stood in her way. The babies finished feeding and settled into an uneasy sleep, but Thomas remained awake, his mind racing with possibilities and plans. He needed allies, people who understood what they were facing and were willing to fight back. Father Miguel was still out there somewhere, hiding and researching, trying to understand the enemy they faced. But first, he had to reach the abandoned mining camp. It would give them a temporary sanctuary, a place to rest and plan their next move. The journey would be dangerous, but Thomas was beginning to understand that safety was an illusion. As long as Magdalena Ravenhill was alive and hunting, nowhere would be truly safe. Dawn came gray and cold, filtering through the pine branches that concealed the cave entrance. Thomas waited until the sun was fully up before venturing out, his rifle ready and his senses alert for any sign of pursuit. The forest seemed peaceful, but he knew better than to trust appearances. Evil like Magdalena's left traces in the world, disturbances that sensitive people could feel. He began the long climb toward the mining camp, following barely visible trails through terrain that grew more rugged with each passing mile. The babies rode quietly in their sling, their dark eyes taking in everything as if they were memorizing the route. Thomas found himself talking to them in soft whispers, telling them about the landmarks they passed, the animals they might see, the stories his grandfather had told him about these same mountains. The mining camp, when he finally reached it, was a collection of weathered buildings scattered across a narrow valley. Most were ruins, their roofs collapsed and their walls crumbling, but a few structures remained intact. Thomas chose a cabin near the center of the camp, one with solid walls and a clear view of the surrounding terrain. Inside, he found evidence of previous occupants, a stone fireplace, crude furniture, supplies left behind by miners who'd given up their dreams of striking it rich. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and it would have to do. Thomas barricaded the door and windows, then created a secure sleeping area for the babies in what had once been a storage room. As he worked, Thomas thought about the network of people who'd tried to help him: Pete, Ezra, Father Miguel, and probably others he'd never meet. They were connected by their opposition to Magdalena Ravenhill, bound together by their refusal to let evil triumph. But they were also isolated, fighting alone against an enemy who seemed to have unlimited resources and supernatural abilities. Babies slept peacefully in their makeshift crib, their small faces relaxed and trusting. Thomas watched them and felt a fierce determination settle in his chest. He would not let them become victims of some ancient ritual. He would not let their innocence be corrupted by evil. Whatever it took, however long it took, he would keep them safe. But as night fell over the abandoned mining camp, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Somewhere in the darkness, unfriendly eyes were measuring distances and planning approaches. The hunt was far from over, and the most dangerous prey was often the kind that turned and fought back. Thomas Stormwind had learned to fight, and he was no longer running. He was preparing for war. Thomas spent 5 days fortifying the mining camp, turning it into a fortress that could withstand a siege. He rigged early warning systems using string and tin cans, created multiple escape routes through the surrounding cliffs, and stockpiled ammunition and supplies in hidden caches throughout the valley. But on the 6th morning, he discovered something that changed everything he thought he knew about the babies he was protecting. While exploring the deepest mine shaft for potential escape routes, Thomas stumbled upon a chamber that shouldn't have existed. The walls were covered in symbols that predated any known writing system, carved deep into the living rock by hands that had worked in absolute darkness. At the center of the chamber sat a stone altar, its surface stained with what could only be centuries of dried blood. The babies had been unusually restless that morning, fussing and crying in ways that seemed almost like communication. When Thomas carried them into the chamber, they fell completely silent, their dark eyes fixed on the carved symbols with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Ember reached out with one tiny hand, her fingers tracing patterns in the air that seemed to mirror the wall carvings. "What are you trying to tell me?" Thomas whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. As if in response, Reed began to make soft sounds that were almost like singing, a melody that seemed to resonate with the stone itself. The carved symbols began to glow with a faint, pulsing light that had no earthly source. Thomas had seen enough supernatural phenomena in his life to recognize power when he encountered it. His grandfather had told him stories of children born with the sight, infants who could see beyond the veil that separated the world of the living from the realm of spirits. But this was something else entirely, something that spoke of ancient bloodlines and forgotten purposes. The light grew brighter, and suddenly Thomas could understand the symbols as clearly as if they were written in English. They told a story that stretched back thousands of years, to a time when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was thinner, more permeable. A time when certain bloodlines carried the ability to bridge those worlds, to serve as conduits for powers that most humans couldn't comprehend. The symbols spoke of a great war fought not with swords and arrows, but with will and spirit. On one side stood the Guardians, humans blessed with the ability to protect the boundaries between worlds. On the other side were the Devourers, beings that fed on spiritual energy and sought to collapse those boundaries entirely. The war had raged for millennia, fought in shadows and secret places, unknown to ordinary humanity. Thomas felt a chill of recognition as he read about the Covenant of Shadows, the ritual that Ezra had mentioned. It wasn't just about gaining power, it was about breaking down the barriers that kept the Devourers trapped in their own realm. The children marked with the crescent sign weren't just victims, they were keys. Their deaths would open doorways that had been sealed since the dawn of time. But the symbols revealed something else, something that filled Thomas with both hope and terror. The same bloodlines that made these children vulnerable also gave them the potential to become guardians themselves. If they could be trained, if they could learn to control their abilities, they could become humanity's greatest defense against the coming darkness. The implications were staggering. Ember and Reed weren't just innocent victims. They were the last hope of a secret war that had been raging since before recorded history. And Magdalena Ravenhill wasn't just a killer. She was a servant of the Devourers, working to complete a ritual that would doom all of humanity. Thomas was still processing this revelation when he heard the sound that chilled his blood, the whinny of horses echoing through the valley. He quickly gathered the babies and made his way to the cabin's concealed observation post, a narrow window that gave him a clear view of the surrounding terrain. What he saw made his heart sink. Magdalena Ravenhill had found them, and she hadn't come alone. A dozen riders spread out across the valley floor, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. But these weren't ordinary soldiers. They moved with an unnatural grace, their horses' hooves making no sound on the rocky ground. And their eyes glowed with the same unnatural light Thomas had seen in the mine shaft. The riders weren't human, at least not anymore. They were something else, something that had once been human but had been transformed by their service to the Devourers. Thomas counted their numbers and checked his ammunition, knowing that conventional weapons might not be enough against enemies like these. Magdalena herself rode at the center of the group, her beauty even more striking and terrible in the harsh mountain light. She dismounted gracefully and walked toward the cabin, her movements fluid and predatory. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the valley, enhanced by supernatural power. "Thomas Stormwind," she called, his name rolling off her tongue like a caress. "I know you're in there, and I know you have my children. There's no point in running anymore. This valley has only one way out, and my servants guard it well." She paused, tilting her head as if listening to something only she could hear. "Bring them to me willingly, and I'll make your death quick. Force me to take them, and I'll make you suffer for days." Thomas felt the babies stir in their sling, and for a moment he thought they might cry out and give away their position. But instead, they fell into an almost supernatural silence, their dark eyes alert and watching. It was as if they understood the danger and were doing everything in their power to help him hide them. "You don't understand what you're protecting," Magdalena continued, her voice taking on a hypnotic quality. "Those children aren't human, not really. They're abominations, creatures of power and shadow that will bring nothing but destruction to this world. I'm offering to take that burden from you, to spare you the horror of watching them grow into monsters." Thomas gritted his teeth, recognizing the lies wrapped in honeyed words. The symbols in the mine shaft had shown him the truth. The children were humanity's hope, not its destruction. But he also understood now why Magdalena wanted them so badly. With their deaths, she could complete the ritual that would give the Devourers access to the physical world. The riders began to close in, moving in a coordinated pattern that would cut off any escape routes. Thomas knew he had only minutes before they reached the cabin. He made a desperate decision, gathering the babies and his essential supplies, then slipping out the back door toward the mine shaft. If he could reach the chamber with the carved symbols, he might be able to use whatever power resided there to protect them. The journey to the mine shaft felt like the longest 100 yards of his life. Every shadow could hide an enemy, every sound could signal discovery. The babies remained perfectly silent, their small bodies warm against his chest, their trust in him absolute. Thomas used every skill his grandfather had taught him, moving like smoke through the rocks and scrub brush. He made it to the mine entrance just as the first rider reached the cabin. Thomas could hear them breaking down the door, their inhuman voices raised in rage as they discovered the empty rooms. He had minutes, maybe less, before they realized where he'd gone. The mine shaft was dark and treacherous, but Thomas navigated it by memory and instinct. The babies seemed to sense their destination, their breathing becoming quicker and more excited as they approached the chamber. When they finally reached the carved room, the symbols immediately began to glow in response to their presence. Thomas set the babies down on the stone altar, his hands shaking as he tried to understand what he was supposed to do. The symbols pulsed with increasing intensity, and he could feel power building in the air around them. The babies reached out toward the carvings, their tiny hands weaving patterns that seemed to activate dormant energies. The sound of pursuit echoed through the mine shaft, growing closer with each passing second. Thomas could hear Magdalena's voice, no longer beautiful but filled with inhuman rage. "You cannot hide from me, Guardian. The children's blood calls to me across any distance. Surrender them now, and I might still allow you to live, Guardian." The word hit Thomas like a physical blow as he realized what the symbols had been trying to tell him. He wasn't just protecting the babies, he was one of them, a descendant of the ancient bloodlines that had fought the devourers for millennia. His mixed heritage, his ability to read the land, his natural skill with tracking and survival, it all made sense now. The babies began to sing, their voices harmonizing in ways that should have been impossible for infants. The sound resonated through the chamber, causing the carved symbols to blaze with brilliant light. Thomas felt power flowing through him, ancient knowledge awakening in his blood. He understood now what he had to do. Magdalena and her servants reached the chamber, just as the ritual reached its crescendo. The devourer's servant stood in the doorway, her beauty transformed into something terrible and alien. "You don't know what you're doing," she snarled, her voice distorting with inhuman harmonics. "Those children are mine by right of blood and sacrifice. They will serve my masters whether you will it or not." "They serve no one," Thomas replied, his voice steady, despite the terror coursing through his veins. "They are guardians, born to protect this world from creatures like you. And so am I." The baby's song reached a crescendo, and the chamber filled with light so bright it was almost blinding. Thomas felt the power of generations flowing through him, the strength of every guardian who had ever stood against the darkness. Magdalena screamed, a sound that was part rage and part agony. The light was burning her, revealing her true form, not a beautiful woman but something twisted and wrong, with too many teeth and eyes like empty holes in reality. Her servants writhed in the doorway, unable to enter the chamber but unwilling to retreat. "This isn't over," Magdalena hissed, her voice now a discordant chorus of inhuman sounds. "There are others like me, others who serve the true masters. We will have these children, and we will have the keys to every world. You cannot protect them forever." The light pulsed one final time, and when it faded, the chamber was empty except for Thomas and the babies. Magdalena and her servants had vanished, driven back by the ancient power that protected this place. But Thomas knew she was right. This was only the beginning. The war between guardians and devourers was far from over. Thomas looked down at Ember and Reed, who had fallen asleep in the aftermath of the ritual. They looked like ordinary babies now, peaceful and innocent, but he knew better. They were the future of humanity's defense against the darkness, and it was his responsibility to keep them safe until they were old enough to understand their destiny. The chamber had given him knowledge, but it had also given him a terrible burden. He was no longer just a man trying to protect two orphaned children. He was a guardian, charged with preparing the next generation for a war that most people didn't even know existed. The thought should have overwhelmed him, but instead, it filled him with purpose. Thomas gathered the babies and began the long journey back to the surface, his mind already working on plans for their next move. The mining camp was no longer safe. Magdalena knew where they were now, and she would return with reinforcements. They needed to find other guardians, other protectors who understood the true nature of the threat they faced. As they emerged from the mine shaft, Thomas looked up at the star-filled sky and felt a sense of connection to something larger than himself. Somewhere out there, other guardians were fighting the same war, protecting other children, keeping the darkness at bay. He was no longer alone in his struggle. The babies stirred in their sling, and Thomas began the long walk toward an uncertain future. Behind them, the abandoned mining camp sat silent in moonlight, its secrets hidden once more. But the war between light and darkness would continue, and Thomas Stormwind would be ready. Thomas spent 2 weeks searching for other guardians, following cryptic clues and ancient signs that led him deeper into the wilderness than he'd ever ventured before. The babies had changed since the ritual in the mine shaft. They slept less, watched more, and sometimes their eyes would track movement that Thomas couldn't see. Their birthmarks had begun to glow faintly in the darkness, pulsing with a rhythm that matched their heartbeats. On a fog-shrouded morning near the Canadian border, He finally found what he was looking for, a hidden settlement called Haven's Rest. The settlement was invisible from any distance, protected by what Thomas now recognized as guardian magic, ancient wards that turned curious eyes away and made travelers forget they'd ever seen signs of human habitation. But Ember and Reed guided him toward it, their small hands pointing unerringly through the mist toward safety. When the fog cleared, Thomas found himself looking at a thriving community of log cabins and stone, buildings nestled in a valley that shouldn't have existed, according to any map he'd ever seen. An elderly woman emerged from the largest cabin, her silver hair braided with beads and feathers, her weathered face marked by the distinctive tattoos that Thomas now understood were guardian symbols. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades training in the ancient arts, and her eyes held the same deep awareness that he'd seen in the babies. Behind her came a procession of other adults, each bearing the marks of their calling, each radiating the quiet confidence of those who had faced darkness and emerged victorious. "You're late," she said simply, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We've been expecting you for 3 days. The children told us you were coming." She gestured toward a group of youngsters playing in a nearby field, and Thomas realized with shock that they were all marked with the crescent birthmark. Some were toddlers barely able to walk, others were teenagers on the verge of adulthood, but all possessed the same otherworldly awareness that set them apart from ordinary children. The woman introduced herself as Sarah Windwalker, the settlement's leader and one of the last surviving members of the Guardian Council. She had been fighting the Shadow War for over 60 years, had seen the rise and fall of a dozen different threats, and had trained 3 generations of young guardians in the arts of protection and combat. Her presence radiated the kind of power that came from a lifetime of service to something greater than oneself. She examined Ember and Reed with the practiced eye of someone who had seen many such children over the years, her expression growing more serious with each passing moment. The babies responded to her touch, their eyes focusing on her face with an intensity that seemed impossible for infants. "These 2 are special," she said finally, her voice filled with both wonder and concern. "Their power is stronger than any I've encountered in decades. But they're also in terrible danger." Thomas felt his heart sink as Sarah explained the situation. Magdalena Ravenhill had not been idle during the week since their confrontation in the mine shaft. She had been gathering allies, both human and otherwise, building an army of devourers and corrupted souls that now numbered in the hundreds. Intelligence reports from Guardian scouts suggested she was planning a final assault on Haven's Rest, determined to claim not just Ember and Reed, but every Guardian child in the settlement. The scope of the threat was staggering. Magdalena had corrupted entire towns, turning their populations into willing servants of the devourers. She had recruited rogue practitioners of the dark arts, promised them power beyond imagination in exchange for their loyalty. Most terrifying of all, she had somehow managed to create stable portals between dimensions, allowing creatures from the Shadow Realm to enter the physical world in unprecedented numbers. "She knows this is our last stronghold," Sarah continued, her voice grim. "Over the past month, she systematically destroyed every other Guardian settlement on the continent. We're the only ones left, and if she can break our defenses and complete the ritual here, she have enough power to tear open permanent doorways between dimensions. The Devourers won't just be able to visit our world, they'll be able to invade it completely." The weight of that revelation settled over Thomas like a physical burden. He had thought he was protecting 2 babies, but he was actually standing at the center of a war that would determine the fate of all humanity. Every choice he had made, every step he had taken, had led to this moment. The abandoned canoe by Willow Creek had been the first move in a cosmic game of chess, and now the final moves were being played out. Sarah led them through the settlement, showing Thomas the preparations that had been made for the coming battle. Every building had been fortified with guardian symbols carved into the walls, creating a network of protective barriers that would channel and amplify their collective power. The older children were being trained in combat techniques that blended martial arts with supernatural abilities, learning to fight with weapons forged from meteoric iron and blessed by ancient rituals. The settlement's defenses were impressive, but would clearly be tested to their limits. Watchtowers had been built at strategic points around the valley, each one manned by guardians who could see across dimensional boundaries. Underground tunnels connected the major buildings, providing secure routes for evacuating non-combatants. If the outer defenses were breached, most impressive of all was the arsenal of weapons and artifacts that the Guardians had collected over the centuries. In the settlement's heart stood a massive stone circle, its surface covered with the same symbols Thomas had seen in the mine shaft. The stones themselves were ancient beyond measure, carved from rock that had fallen from the sky during the early days of the world. "This is where it will happen," Sarah explained, her voice filled with reverence and determination. "If Magdalena breaks through our outer defenses, she'll try to complete the ritual here. The stone circle will amplify whatever power she draws from the children, but it will also amplify our resistance." Thomas looked around at the settlement's defenders and felt a chill of apprehension. There were perhaps 50 adults capable of fighting, most of them middle-aged or elderly. The younger generation was still learning to control their abilities, and the oldest guardians were too frail for extended combat. Against an army of hundreds, their chances seemed impossibly slim. But then he saw the determination in their eyes, the quiet confidence of people who had chosen to stand against the darkness, regardless of the odds. "There are other settlements," Sarah said, reading his expression. "Guardian communities scattered across the continent, each protecting their own children. But they're all under attack now. Magdalena's servants have been striking simultaneously, preventing any one group from coming to aid the others. We're on our own." The isolation was complete, but Thomas sensed that the Guardians had faced similar odds before and survived through courage and unity. That night, Thomas stood watch on the settlement's perimeter, his enhanced senses alert for any sign of approaching danger. The babies slept peacefully in the cabin Sarah had assigned them, their small bodies glowing faintly with guardian power. Other watchers moved through the darkness around him, their footsteps silent, but their presence reassuring. The night was filled with the sounds of preparation, weapons being sharpened, barriers being reinforced, final prayers being offered to whatever powers protected the innocent. The attack came at dawn, not with the thunder of hoofbeats or the clash of weapons, but with a silence so complete it seemed to press against the eardrums. Thomas felt the hair on his arms stand up as he recognized the unnatural quiet that preceded a devourer assault. The fog that had protected the settlement began to swirl and thicken, taking on shapes that hurt to look at directly. Reality itself seemed to bend and warp as alien geometries pressed against the boundaries of the physical world. Magdalena's voice echoed across the valley, amplified by powers that made the very air vibrate with malevolent energy. Her words carried across dimensions, reaching into the minds of every guardian in the settlement with tendrils of fear and despair. "Guardians of Haven's Rest, your time is ended. Surrender the children, and I will make your deaths swift. Resist, and I will feed your souls to my masters one by one." The fog began to part, revealing an army that defied description. Corrupted humans rode alongside creatures that had never been human, their forms shifting and changing like living nightmares. Some were giants with too many limbs, others were masses of shadow and hunger that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. At their head rode Magdalena herself, her beauty now completely transformed into something terrible and alien. Thomas ran back to the cabin where Ember and Reed were sleeping, gathering them quickly as the settlement's alarm bells began to ring. All around him, guardian families were implementing their emergency plans, parents rushing to protect their children, while fighters took up positions along the defensive perimeter. The stone circle at the settlement's heart began to glow with protective energy, its ancient power awakening in response to the approaching threat. Sarah Windwalker appeared at his side, her elderly frame now radiating power that made the air around her shimmer like heat waves. Her tattoos had begun to glow with the same inner light as the stone circle, and her eyes held the fierce determination of someone who had faced this moment in 1,000 nightmares. "Take the children to the inner sanctuary," she commanded. "If the outer defenses fall, it will be our last line of protection. Whatever happens, don't let them leave that circle until the battle is over." The first wave of attackers struck the settlement's outer wards like a tsunami of darkness. Thomas felt the impact through the ground beneath his feet, a vibration that spoke of immense supernatural forces colliding. The protective barriers held, but he could see cracks beginning to form in the invisible walls that kept the devourers at bay. Sparks of energy cascaded through the air like falling stars, each one marking a small victory or defeat in the ongoing battle between light and shadow. Thomas reached the stone circle just as the second wave hit. This time, several of the outer wards shattered completely, allowing corrupted humans to pour into the settlement's perimeter. The sound of battle erupted across Haven's Rest, not just the clash of weapons, but the crackle of supernatural energy, and the inhuman screams of creatures that had no business existing in the mortal world. Guardian fighters met the invaders with weapons that blazed with holy fire, their training and courage the only things standing between the children and certain death. Inside the stone circle, Thomas found himself surrounded by the settlement's youngest children, their eyes wide with fear, but their small hands already weaving protective patterns in the air. These were the next generation of guardians, some barely old enough to walk, but already showing signs of the power that would one day make them humanity's defenders. Ember and Reed seemed to recognize their kinship with the other marked children, reaching out with tiny fingers to touch the hands of toddlers and teenagers alike. The battle raged for hours, with the Guardians giving ground slowly but steadily. Thomas watched through the circle's protective barriers as brave men and women fell defending their homes and families. Sarah Windwalker stood at the center of the defensive line, her power blazing like a beacon as she held back creatures that would have destroyed lesser fighters with a glance. But for every enemy that fell, two more seemed to take its place. The attackers kept coming, wave after wave of corruption and hatred. Thomas realized with growing horror that Magdalena wasn't just trying to break through the defenses, she was deliberately forcing the Guardians to exhaust their power, wearing them down until they could no longer maintain the protective barriers. It was a strategy of attrition, and it was working. One by one, the outer defenses began to fail as their maintainers fell or collapsed from exhaustion. The outer defenses finally collapsed as the sun reached its zenith, and Magdalena Ravenhill walked into Haven's Rest as if she owned it. Her human disguise was completely gone now, replaced by something that seemed to shift between dimensions with each step. The very ground withered beneath her feet, and the air around her crackled with energy that made reality itself seem unstable. She had become something beyond human understanding, a conduit for powers that belonged to the spaces between worlds. Behind her came creatures that defied description, beings of shadow and hunger that had been waiting eons for the chance to enter the physical world. They moved through the settlement like a plague, corrupting everything they touched, turning the peaceful haven into a wasteland of darkness and despair. Buildings aged decades in seconds, plants withered and died, and the very air became thick with the stench of decay and hopelessness. Thomas clutched the babies tighter as Magdalena approached the stone circle, her inhuman eyes fixed on the children gathered within. Up close, he could see that she was no longer entirely present in this reality. Parts of her flickered in and out of existence, as if she existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. At last, she said, her voice now a chorus of discordant harmonics, the final pieces of the puzzle. With their deaths, The great work will be complete, and my masters will have their rightful dominion over all worlds. The stone circle's barriers held against her initial assault, but Thomas could see them weakening with each passing moment. The ancient stones began to crack under the strain, and the protective symbols carved into their surfaces started to dim. The other children were doing their best to reinforce the defenses, but they were too young, too inexperienced to stand against a being of Magdalena's power. In minutes, maybe less, the barriers would fail completely. That's when Ember and Reed began to sing, their voices, impossibly clear and pure, rose above the chaos of battle in a harmony that seemed to touch something fundamental in the structure of reality itself. The other children joined them, their young voices blending in a chorus that Thomas felt in his bones. The song was wordless but filled with meaning, a melody that spoke of hope and protection, of the fundamental goodness that existed at the heart of creation. The song was power, but not the kind that destroyed or corrupted. It was the power of creation, of hope, of the fundamental force that had shaped the universe from chaos. Thomas felt it flowing through him, awakening abilities he had never known he possessed. Around the circle, the other guardian children began to glow with the same inner light, their combined power creating a beacon that could be seen across dimensions. Magdalena screamed as the song reached its crescendo, her form beginning to blur and distort. The creatures she had brought with her writhed in agony, their unnatural bodies unable to withstand the pure creative force that the children were channeling. "This is impossible," she shrieked, her voice now filled with genuine fear. "Children cannot wield such power. They are mine by right of blood and sacrifice. They belong to no one," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the battlefield with supernatural clarity. "They are guardians, born to protect this world from creatures like you. And they will never stop fighting." The babies in his arms added their voices to the chorus, their infant cries somehow harmonizing perfectly with the older children's song, creating a symphony of power that made the very air vibrate with protective energy. The light from the stone circle began to expand, pushing back the darkness that had consumed the settlement. Wherever it touched, the corruption began to heal, withered plants sprouting new growth and poisoned ground returning to wholesome earth. The surviving guardians felt their strength returning, their depleted power reserves refilling with energy drawn from the children's song. Those who had fallen in battle stirred and opened their eyes, healed by the wave of creative force washing over them. Magdalena made one final desperate assault on the stone circle, throwing everything she had left against the barriers. For a moment, it seemed she might succeed. The light flickered, the song wavered, and cracks appeared in the ancient stones. But then Sarah Windwalker appeared beside Thomas, her weathered hands joining the children's protective weaving, her own power adding to the growing chorus of resistance. "This is for every child you've murdered," she said, her voice filled with righteous fury. "This is for every family you've destroyed. This is for every guardian who died protecting the innocent." Power flowed from her into the stone circle, and the light blazed so bright it could be seen for miles, a beacon of hope in a world that had grown too dark. Magdalena's scream of rage and agony cut across dimensions, and then she was gone, banished back to whatever realm had spawned her. The creatures she had brought with her followed, their forms dissolving like smoke in the morning wind. The portals between worlds snapped shut, sealing away the shadow realm once more. The battle was over, and the guardians had won. In the aftermath, as the settlement began to rebuild and tend to their wounded, Thomas found himself changed in ways he was still struggling to understand. The babies in his arms looked up at him with eyes that held ancient wisdom, and he knew that their journey together was far from over. There would be other battles, other threats, other children to protect. But now he understood his true purpose in the world. Haven's Rest was safe, and the next generation of guardians was growing stronger with each passing day. Thomas looked out over the valley where evil had been defeated by the power of innocence. and hope, and felt a deep satisfaction settle in his soul. The war between light and darkness would continue, but humanity would not face it alone. The Guardians would stand watch, protecting the world from shadows that ordinary people would never see. And at the center of it all, two babies who had been abandoned beside a creek would grow up to become humanity's greatest defenders. Thomas Stormwind had found his purpose, and nothing would ever be the same. 5 years had passed since the battle at Haven's Rest, and Thomas Stormwind stood on the porch of his rebuilt cabin, watching Ember and Reed play in the meadow below. The children had grown into remarkable youngsters. Ember with her wild dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold starlight. Reed with his quiet intensity and the uncanny ability to sense danger before it arrived. They were no longer the helpless infants he'd found beside Willow Creek, but they were still his responsibility, still the most precious things in his increasingly complex world. The victory over Magdalena Ravenhill had not ended the Shadow War, but it had fundamentally changed its nature. The Devourer's ability to enter the physical world had been severely curtailed, their most powerful servant banished to the spaces between dimensions. But other threats had emerged to take her place. Human cultists who worshipped the dark powers, rogue practitioners who sought to claim Guardian children for their own purposes, and worst of all, corrupt members of the Guardian Council who believed that power should be used to rule rather than protect. Thomas had become something he'd never expected to be: a teacher, a leader, a father figure to dozens of extraordinary children. Haven's Rest had been rebuilt as a school and sanctuary, where Guardian children from across the continent came to learn control of their abilities and understanding of their destiny. The settlement now housed over 200 people, including 63 children with supernatural abilities, their families, and the adults who had dedicated their lives to protecting them. The morning routine had become as familiar as breathing. But it was far more complex than Thomas had ever imagined when he first found the babies. He would wake before dawn to check the settlement's defenses, reviewing the ward patterns and ensuring that the protective barriers remained strong. The network of supernatural protections now extended for miles in every direction, creating a safe zone where Guardian children could develop their abilities without fear of detection or attack. After his security rounds, Thomas would prepare breakfast for the children, a task that had evolved into coordinating a small army of volunteers who helped feed the growing population. Ember and Reed always ate together, their bond as strong as that of biological siblings, while the other children formed their own family groups based on age and ability. The dining hall buzzed with conversations in multiple languages, as children from different cultural backgrounds shared their heritage and traditions. Sarah Windwalker had not survived the final battle with Magdalena, but she had lived long enough to see the children's power awakened and to pass on her knowledge to Thomas. Her death had been peaceful, surrounded by those she had protected and trained. Her final words a blessing on the next generation of Guardians. Thomas kept her journal on his desk, filled with decades of wisdom about training young people with supernatural abilities, and he consulted it daily when facing new challenges. The children's education went far beyond the traditional subjects taught in ordinary schools. They learned mathematics and literature, history, and science, but they also studied the ancient languages needed to read Guardian texts, the meditation techniques required to control their power, and the combat skills that might one day save their lives. Most importantly, they learned the ethical principles that separated Guardians from those who would use power for selfish ends. Thomas had established a comprehensive curriculum that addressed every aspect of Guardian training. Physical conditioning classes helped the children develop the strength and agility needed for supernatural combat. History lessons taught them about the ancient war between light and darkness, helping them understand their place in a conflict that stretched back to the dawn of civilization. Philosophy classes explored the moral implications of possessing great power, preparing them to make difficult decisions under pressure. Ember had developed into a prodigy of protective magic, able to create barriers that could withstand supernatural assault and healing, energies that could mend both physical and spiritual wounds. She was naturally empathetic, drawn to comfort those in pain, but she also possessed a fierce determination to protect the innocent that reminded Thomas of Sarah Windwalker. Her power manifested as golden light that seemed to warm everything it touched, and her presence could calm even the most frightened or traumatized children. Reed had taken a different path, his abilities focused on detection and communication. He could sense hostile intentions from miles away, could communicate telepathically with other guardians, and most remarkably, could see across the dimensional barriers that separated different realities. His power appeared as silver light that revealed hidden truths and illuminated deceptions. Together, the two children complemented each other perfectly, their combined abilities making them formidable protectors despite their youth. The settlement had attracted other survivors from the Shadow War, former members of destroyed Guardian communities, refugees from towns that had been corrupted by dark magic, and ordinary people who had somehow learned of the supernatural world and wanted to help protect it. This diverse population had created a unique culture that blended traditional Guardian wisdom with practical frontier survival skills, creating something entirely new in the history of the Order. Thomas had also become something of a legend in the wider world, though most people didn't know his real name or the true nature of his work. Stories spread of a mysterious protector who appeared whenever children were in danger, a man who could track through any terrain and fight supernatural enemies with weapons that blazed with holy fire. The stories were greatly exaggerated, but they served a useful purpose in deterring those who might threaten Guardian children. The greatest challenge Thomas faced was not external threats, but the internal struggles of adolescent Guardians coming to terms with their abilities. Power without wisdom was dangerous, and teenage emotions combined with supernatural abilities could create problems that defied conventional solutions. He had learned to be part teacher, part counselor, part surrogate parent to young people who were dealing with pressures that ordinary teenagers couldn't imagine. One of his most difficult students was a 15-year-old named Marcus, whose power manifested as an ability to influence other people's emotions. The boy had arrived at Haven's Rest after accidentally causing a riot in his hometown, his uncontrolled abilities turning a peaceful gathering into a violent mob. Thomas had spent months teaching Marcus the meditation techniques needed to maintain emotional discipline, but the teenager's guilt over his past mistakes made progress slow and difficult. Another challenging case was Elena, a 12-year-old who could see the future in fragmented visions that often came true in unexpected ways. Her predictions were usually accurate, but incomplete, showing glimpses of events without enough context to understand their meaning. Thomas had to help her learn to interpret her visions, while also teaching her not to become paralyzed by knowledge of potential disasters she couldn't prevent. The most heartbreaking student was little Anna, only 7 years old, who had been orphaned when her guardian parents were killed by cultists seeking to claim her unusual abilities. She could speak with the spirits of the dead, a power that brought her comfort, but also made her seem strange and frightening to other children. Thomas had to help her learn to control her gift while also providing the emotional support she needed to overcome her trauma. But there were success stories too. David, now 16, had learned to transform his body into living stone, making him nearly invulnerable to physical attack. He had initially been terrified of his abilities, afraid that he was becoming a monster. But Thomas had helped him understand that his power was a gift to be used in service of others. David now served as one of the settlement's primary defenders, his courage and determination inspiring the younger children. Maria, 14 years old, could manipulate plant life with her thoughts, causing flowers to bloom in winter and making crops grow in barren soil. She had initially viewed her abilities as merely decorative, but Thomas had helped her understand their potential for healing and protection. She now maintained the settlement's gardens and food production, her work ensuring that the community could remain self-sufficient even during difficult times. The settlement's daily routine was carefully structured to provide both education and recreation. Mornings were devoted to academic subjects and individual training sessions, where each child worked on developing their specific abilities under careful supervision. Afternoons were spent in group activities that taught teamwork and cooperation, while evenings were reserved for storytelling, music, and the kind of normal childhood experiences that helped balance the extraordinary nature of their lives. Thomas had also established a network of safe houses and communication routes that stretched across the continent, allowing guardian families to stay in contact and coordinate their efforts against common threats. This network had proven invaluable in recent months, as reports came in of increased cultist activity and strange phenomena appearing in remote areas. The Shadow War continued, but the Guardians were no longer fighting it alone. The communication network relied on a combination of traditional methods and supernatural abilities. Guardian children with telepathic gifts could send messages across vast distances, while those with prophetic abilities could provide advance warning of impending threats. The network had grown to include over 300 active members, from full-fledged guardians to ordinary citizens who had been too shed by the supernatural world and wanted to help protect it. The most recent threat had been a group calling themselves the New Order, led by a charismatic preacher named Brother Ezekiel, who claimed that guardian children were the key to bringing about divine judgment on humanity. His followers had attempted to kidnap several young guardians, believing that their deaths would trigger an apocalypse that would cleanse the world of sin. Thomas had personally led the mission to stop them, a confrontation that had ended with Brother Ezekiel's death and the dissolution of his cult. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of a new generation of adult guardians. Young people who had been trained at Haven's Rest and were now ready to take on leadership roles in the wider community. These new guardians combined traditional wisdom with innovative techniques, creating approaches to supernatural threats that were more effective than anything the older generation had developed. Thomas often found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The frightened, lonely hunter who had discovered 2 babies beside a creek seemed like a different person entirely. He had been transformed by his experiences, shaped by the responsibility of protecting the innocent and the privilege of watching extraordinary children grow into their power. The scars from old battles still marked his body, but they had become badges of honor rather than sources of pain. The settlement had also become a place of pilgrimage for ordinary people who had been touched by the supernatural world. Families whose children showed signs of unusual abilities made long journeys to Haven's Rest, seeking guidance and training. People who had encountered supernatural threats in their own communities came seeking help and protection. The Guardians had become known as healers and protectors, their reputation spreading through word of mouth and desperate whispers. Thomas had established strict protocols for dealing with these visitors. Anyone who came to Haven's Rest seeking help was welcomed, but they were also carefully screened to ensure they weren't cultists or agents of hostile forces. The settlement's defenses had been updated and strengthened, incorporating lessons learned from the battle with Magdalena and subsequent encounters with other threats. The stone circle at the community's heart had been rebuilt with additional protections, creating a sanctuary that could withstand almost any assault. The screening process involved multiple layers of verification. New arrivals were interviewed by experienced guardians who could detect deception and hostile intent. Their backgrounds were investigated through the Guardian Network, checking for any connections to known threats. Most importantly, the children themselves were consulted, as their supernatural senses could often detect dangers that adult guardians might miss. The children's education had also evolved to meet changing threats. They learned not just about the traditional enemies of the Guardians, but about modern dangers like government agencies that sought to study or control supernatural abilities, corporations that wanted to exploit Guardian powers for profit, and extremist groups that viewed anyone with unusual abilities as either divine messengers or demonic threats. Thomas had also made an unexpected discovery about his own heritage. While researching guardian genealogies, he had learned that his family line stretched back much further than he had imagined. His ancestors had been protecting the boundaries between worlds for countless generations, their mixed heritage making them particularly effective at bridging different cultures and traditions. This knowledge had given him a deeper sense of purpose and connection to the ancient mission of the Guardians. The genealogical research had revealed a network of Guardian families that spanned multiple continents, each one adapting the ancient traditions to their local circumstances while maintaining the core mission of protecting the innocent. Thomas had been able to establish contact with several of these distant relatives, creating new alliances and sharing knowledge that had been isolated for generations. The relationship between Ember and Reed had deepened as they grew older, their bond transcending ordinary sibling affection to become something that approached telepathic connection. They could sense each other's emotions across great distances, coordinate their abilities without verbal communication, and provide mutual support during the most challenging training exercises. Thomas often wondered if they were destined to become the founders of a new Guardian dynasty. As the sun began to set over Haven's Rest, Thomas called the children in for dinner. The evening meal had become a sacred ritual, a time when the entire community gathered to share food, stories, and fellowship. The dining hall was filled with the sound of laughter and conversation, the kind of ordinary human warmth that balanced the extraordinary nature of their lives. During dinner, Thomas listened to the children talk about their day, the lessons they had learned, the challenges they had faced, the small victories that marked their progress toward mastery of their abilities. He offered guidance when asked, shared stories from his own experiences when appropriate, and simply enjoyed the privilege of watching these remarkable young people grow and develop. The dinner conversations often revealed insights that formal training sessions missed. Children would share their fears and doubts, their hopes and dreams, their concerns about the future, and their role in the ongoing conflict between light and darkness. Thomas learned as much from these informal discussions as he did from any formal report or strategic briefing. After dinner, the children dispersed to their various evening activities. Some went to the library to research ancient texts, others practiced their abilities in the training grounds, and a few simply played games or talked with friends. Thomas made his rounds, checking on each child, offering encouragement where needed, and ensuring that everyone felt safe and supported. The evening rounds were one of Thomas's favorite parts of the day. He would stop by the library to discuss research projects with the older students, visit the training grounds to observe practice sessions, and spend time in the common areas where the younger children played. Each interaction was an opportunity to strengthen the bonds that held the community together. As the night deepened, Thomas found himself alone with Ember and Reed in the cabin they shared. The children had grown too old for bedtime stories, but they still enjoyed the quiet moments before sleep when they could talk about their dreams and fears, their hopes for the future, and the challenges they would face as they grew into their roles as guardians. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found us?" Ember asked, her voice soft in the lamplight. Thomas considered the question seriously, as he always did when the children asked him about their shared history. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I think we were meant to find each other. The world has a way of bringing together the people who need each other most." Reed nodded thoughtfully, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "Sarah used to say that there are no coincidences in the Guardian world," he said. "Everything happens for a reason, even when we can't see what that reason is." Thomas smiled, remembering the old woman's wisdom and the way she had shaped all their lives through her teachings and example. As the children finally settled into sleep, Thomas took up his familiar position by the window, watching over them and the settlement beyond. The night was peaceful, filled with the ordinary sounds of a community at rest. But Thomas remained vigilant, knowing that threats could emerge without warning, that the price of protecting the innocent was eternal watchfulness. The stars wheeled. Overhead, the same stars that had watched over guardian settlements for thousands of years. Thomas felt connected to that ancient tradition, part of an unbroken chain of protectors stretching back to the dawn of human civilization. The knowledge brought him comfort and strength, reminding him that he was not alone in his mission. Somewhere in the darkness, other guardians stood their own watches, protecting their own communities, training their own students, fighting their own battles against the forces of corruption and despair. The network that Thomas had helped create was strong and growing stronger, a web of mutual support that spanned the continent and beyond. As dawn approached, Thomas allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The children were safe, the settlement was secure, and the next generation of guardians was preparing to take on the challenges that lay ahead. The Shadow War would continue, but humanity would not face it alone. The light of hope burned bright in Haven's Rest, and it would continue to burn as long as there were those willing to tend the flame. Thomas Stormwind had found his purpose, and in doing so, he had helped secure the future of a world that would never fully understand the debt it owed to the children sleeping peacefully in their beds. The dawn brought new challenges, new opportunities, and new hope for all who stood against the darkness. The journey that had begun with 2 babies hidden beneath the canoe had become something far greater than he had ever imagined. But then, the best journeys always did.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.